Breaking news just moments ago, we learned that a U.S. military refueling aircraft has gone down over western Iraq as part of Operation Epic Fury, and that rescue efforts as we speak are underway. The area, which you see there on your screen, is described by U.S. Central Command as friendly airspace, and the military says it's working to provide clarity to military families on exactly what happened. So let's bring in CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata. He's joining us now with what we know, at least right now. Charlie, good evening.
4 American airmen are dead. The Pentagon calls it a non-combat accident. But a militant group in Iraq says they brought the plane down themselves. Both versions cannot be true, which means someone is lying. And the truth could expose something far bigger. Because the aircraft that crashed wasn't just another military transport. It was a KC-135 Stratotanker, the aerial lifeline that keeps U.S. jets flying across the Middle East against Iran. When one of those tankers disappears from the sky, the consequences ripple through the entire war. And what investigators find next may change how this conflict is understood. Here's the thing about a KC-135. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. These are not fragile aircraft. So when CENTCOM came out and said non-combat accident, a lot of people, including people who know this airspace well, raised an eyebrow. Let's take a look at what we actually know. The crash happened around 2 p.m. Eastern Time on March 12, 2026, which is 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. That puts it in the early evening local time in Iraq, so still daylight. CENTCOM described it as happening over western Iraq during ongoing operations in what they called friendly airspace. That phrase is doing a lot of work, and we'll get to that. What's important right now is the mission setup. 2 KC-135s were flying together, which is totally standard for high-tempo refueling operations. These tankers don't usually fly solo in a combat zone. You run them in pairs so you've got backup, redundancy, a second set of eyes. So one goes down, and the other lands safely. That's the detail right at the center of this whole thing, and it matters more than people are giving it credit for. Here's why. If a militia group had a real surface-to-air weapon system capable of reaching a high-altitude tanker, and they used it, you'd expect them to engage both aircraft. That's just how these groups operate when they have something that actually works. You don't fire once and walk away. You press the advantage. The fact that the second KC-135 made it back without incident is a real data point, and it's one that lines up better with mechanical failure than with a successful shoot-down. Now, 6 people were on board. CENTCOM confirmed 4 crew members were killed, and 2 others were initially listed as missing but believed to be alive. 6 total is a full crew complement for a KC-135 on a combat mission. You've got the pilot, co-pilot, boom operator, and additional crew depending on the mission profile. These are not small crews, and this is not a small loss. The KC-135 Stratotanker has been flying since the 1950s. It's a big, slow aircraft, not a fast mover at all. Think of it as a flying gas station. It cruises at high altitude, somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 feet, at speeds that are nowhere close to the jets it's refueling. That altitude and speed profile is designed for efficiency and to stay above most ground-based threats, which is relevant when you start asking what could even reach it. Western Iraq right now is a complicated piece of geography. It's a major routing area for U.S. logistics and air operations, especially with ongoing U.S.-Israeli operations against Iran happening in the region. And it's also an area where Iran-aligned militia groups, Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, and others, have been operating for years.
Yeah, good evening to you, Tony. We just got off the phone with Central Command, CENTCOM, and they've said it in a statement tonight. U.S. Central Command is aware of the loss of a U.S. KC-135 refueling aircraft. The incident occurred, as you said, in friendly airspace during Operation Epic Fury. Rescue efforts are ongoing. 2 aircraft were involved in the incident. One of the aircraft went down in western Iraq. That's the Al-Anbar province. The second has landed safely. This was not due to friendly fire or hostile fire. More information will be made available as the situation develops. according to the statement, we ask for continued patience to gather additional details and to provide clarity for the families of the service members. And I just have to point out, we understand that the two of the aircraft were involved were both refuelers.
So, friendly airspace is a designation that reflects the official U.S. position. But it doesn't mean the ground below is clear of hostile actors. The daylight timing matters too. 2 p.m. Eastern puts this crash happening with full visibility on the ground in Iraq. Anyone within range could see it. Ground observers, militia spotters, anyone with a phone, they would have seen something. That affects both what kind of attack would be plausible and how fast a claim of responsibility could get out. So here's what's confirmed. A KC-135 went down over western Iraq. 4 Americans were killed, and the second aircraft in that same mission landed safely. The investigation is open. CENTCOM says it wasn't hostile fire or friendly fire. The Islamic resistance in Iraq says they did it. And right now, there's a significant gap between what's been confirmed and what's being claimed by both sides. CENTCOM's confidence about ruling out hostile fire actually tells you something about how these investigations work. When the Pentagon says not hostile fire, most people hear everything's fine. But that's not what they're actually saying. It's a much more specific claim than that, and it's worth slowing down on. CENTCOM ruled out 2 separate things in their statement. Hostile fire, meaning an enemy intentionally shot the aircraft down, and friendly fire, meaning a U.S. or allied weapons system accidentally engaged it. Those are different categories, and ruling out both of them early, before a full investigation is done, is a significant move. So what are they basing that on? And is that confidence actually justified? Here's why they can say it with some confidence even this early. U.S. military aircraft in a combat zone are tracked constantly. Radar data, telemetry, flight data recorders if they're recoverable. Investigators have a lot to work with. And one of the first things they look at is the flight profile in the moments before the crash. A plane that gets hit by a missile behaves very differently in its final seconds than a plane that has a mechanical failure. The data usually shows that pretty clearly. A missile strike at altitude also leaves a specific physical signature. The aircraft breaks apart in a particular way. Debris scatters in a pattern that's different from a structural failure or an engine problem. And if the flight data recorder captured those last few seconds, you can often tell whether an explosion came from inside the airframe or outside it. That distinction matters a lot. An internal explosion points toward mechanical failure. An external one points toward a weapon strike. There's also a hard technical constraint here. Most man-portable air defense systems, man-pads, the shoulder-fired missiles that militia groups typically carry, top out well below where a KC-135 cruises. A tanker flying at 30,000 feet or higher is simply out of range for most of those systems. So even if a militia group wanted to shoot it down with a manpad, they probably couldn't reach it. That's a real limitation, and it shapes what's even plausible. That said, CENTCOM has a reason to be careful about how they frame this beyond just the facts. If a militia group successfully targeted a KC-135, one of the most important support aircraft the U.S. operates, that's a massive propaganda win for that group. It tells every Iran-aligned faction in the region that American air assets are vulnerable. It raises serious questions about whether U.S. air operations in Iraq are as safe as the military says they are. Admitting that publicly, even if the evidence pointed that way, would have real strategic consequences. So there's a legitimate question sitting here. Is the non-hostile framing purely based on the technical evidence? Or does it also reflect a desire to control the narrative during an active, high-tempo campaign? And here's the thing. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. The evidence might genuinely point toward mechanical failure, and it might also be convenient that it does. Both can be true at the same time. The bottom line is that CENTCOM has real tools for figuring this out. Radar data, debris patterns, flight recorders. And those tools are pretty good at telling the difference between a shoot-down and an accident. So the non-hostile call isn't coming from nowhere, but it's also coming very early, and the U.S. has clear reasons beyond just the evidence to push that framing right now. So take it seriously. But don't treat it as the final word until the full investigation is done and the physical evidence backs it up. Now let's look at the other side of this. Who exactly is the Islamic resistance in Iraq? And do they actually have anything capable of reaching a KC-135? The Islamic resistance in Iraq put out a claim of responsibility, and on the surface that sounds serious. But claims like this are also a weapon, and they need to be stress tested before anyone runs with them. So let's take a look at who these guys actually are. The Islamic resistance in Iraq isn't one group. It's an umbrella term for a loose coalition of Iran-aligned Shia militias operating inside Iraq. The biggest names under that banner are Kataib Hezbollah and Harakat al-Nujaba. Both groups have been active for years. Both receive weapons and training from Iran, and both have a long history of targeting U.S. assets in the region. Their claim was broadcast on state TV, and they said they used the appropriate weapon to bring the aircraft down. That phrasing is vague enough to mean almost anything. These groups have hit U.S. bases with rockets and drones before. And during earlier phases of the conflict, they launched dozens of drone attacks. So dismissing them outright would be a mistake. They're real, they're armed, and they've caused real damage. But taking every claim at face value would also be a mistake, because this is exactly where their information strategy kicks in. Here's the technical question that actually matters. Shooting down a KC-135 at altitude is genuinely hard.
Yeah, it's important to emphasize that we don't know, but what we do know is that operations, these aerial refueling operations that these kinds of aircraft do, are inherently risky. The whole point of the operation is to bring one plane in close proximity with another plane and physically touch a piece of one to the other to transfer the fuel. These crews have been at it now for well over a week. We're at day 13 of this operation, and it's easy to imagine things can go wrong up there in the dark, high up in the sky.
You say they've been at it. What is the mission for this type of plane in the skies over the Middle East?
You don't do it with a rocket or a man-pad. You need a surface-to-air missile system with serious range and real guidance capability. Something like a Soviet-era SA-6 or better. Those systems exist in the region, but they're not easy to move. They're not easy to hide. And operating one requires real training. It's not a weapon you just point and fire. Iran has supplied these groups with advanced weapons before. Anti-ship missiles, longer-range rockets, things that go well beyond basic infantry gear. So it's not impossible they have access to something capable of reaching a high-altitude tanker. But not impossible is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It's very different from saying they actually did it. Here's why the claim itself is so valuable to them even if they didn't pull it off. A successful shoot-down claim signals to their supporters that they can hit U.S. assets at will. It puts pressure on the Iraqi government, which is already caught between Washington and Tehran. And it muddies the water around every future aircraft loss in the region. Because now every crash looks like a potential shoot-down, and that confusion is itself strategically useful. They don't need the claim to be true for it to do damage. The speed of the claim is also worth noting. These groups monitor U.S. military communications and news closely, and a crash announcement is an opportunity they move on fast. That's true whether they did it or not. Quick claims are standard practice for them, so the timing alone doesn't tell you much about whether they're actually responsible. There's also some useful context from earlier in this conflict. On March 1st, 3 U.S. F-15E Strike Eagles were shot down by Kuwaiti air defenses in a friendly fire incident. That's a real example of how complicated this airspace is. Aircraft going down because of something that had nothing to do with enemy action. And that's exactly the kind of environment where a false claim of responsibility gains traction, because the baseline level of confusion is already high. So here's where things stand. The Islamic resistance in Iraq has motive, a track record of attacks, and possibly some level of capability. But claiming a shoot-down and actually executing one against a high-altitude tanker are two completely different things. The physical evidence from the crash site and the flight data is what's going to settle this. Not a press release pushed out through state TV in a matter of seconds after CENTCOM went public. Here's the bottom line. 4 Americans are dead, the investigation is open, and 2 competing stories are out there. The U.S. military has the flight data. The militia group has every reason to take credit whether they did it or not. The truth is in the physical evidence, and that takes time. This war started February 28th and has already cost 15 American lives, including those 4. So the next time a military statement rules something out early, ask what evidence it's based on and who benefits from that framing. Watch for the investigation results. If CENTCOM's ruling changes, that tells you something important. Bye for now.